Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
It's a delight to be back. Yesterday we had a day of practice, and it's also nice to be here in springtime, see old faces, and to practice together. I was told this month has been a series of talks about Chan Buddhism. I am not qualified to say something about that, and so I'm not going to. However, Venerable Kung Shu and myself were chatting this morning and came up with some ideas. I'd like to talk about the telling the difference between the part of a fruit we eat and the skin or rind that we compost. This doesn't apply to all fruits, but if you think of watermelons, oranges, jackfruits, if you know durian, those of us who've lived in Southeast Asia do. It makes me sick, but some people love it. Anyway, there are many fruits and some vegetables, bananas, mangoes, where there's an outer covering that we don't eat. Nowadays, of course, you can go to the store and buy canned or plastic wrapped versions, like you can get mango in Bangkok and they've skinned it for you and it comes in nice little pieces. Or you can buy mixed fruit salad in cans and so on. But naturally, all or most fruits have some kind of outer protection that allows the inside part to grow, to develop into something that we and other animals find nutritious and tasty. If we were lazy or foolhardy, we'd wish for fruit without skin. It's too much of a hassle to peel the grapefruit. Can't we just have the good part? And of course, it would be even more foolhardy to just take our nice vegetable or fruit, put it on an altar and stare at it and bow to it and worship it without ever eating the nutritious part. This metaphor was used by my teacher, Buddhayana Bhikkhu, to talk about religion. That religion just about everywhere, including Buddhism, has both the inner flesh, the nutritious part that can really nurture us, and it's got an outer covering, skin or rind, which is necessary. Some people, there's a lot of this in North America, some people want to get rid of the skin. You'll hear people who don't want any cultural baggage. Though most of them just bring in their own cultural baggage without realizing it. So Ajahn Buddhadasa's point was, it's natural that there will be the outer coverings, the wrappings, but what matters the most is the inner flesh or fruit. Buddhism comes in many flavors. To name a few, Chan, Pure Land, and then their Japanese expressions, Zen and Jodoshu, and then there's the Jodoshu offshoot, Shinshu, or Jodo Shinshu, etc., all the different flavors of Japanese Buddhism. China, of course, has more than Chan and Pure Land. There's the various kinds of Tibetan Buddhism. There's what's nowadays called Theravada Buddhism, which nominally is my background, but later I'll explain why I say nominally. And now in the States, some people are using the term Vipassana Buddhism because they don't identify with Theravada or the other Asian flavors, but they want to borrow certain aspects, in this case, that come largely from Theravada countries, Vipassana in its different forms. And then, I'm not quite sure what they're doing, but I know some of these teachers and they're doing good things. So that's yet a kind of more Americanized flavor. And the last one I'll mention is secular Buddhism. There are secular Buddhists who think I'm a secular Buddhist, or at least have a lot in common. I don't think of myself in that way because I don't mind having a religion. But there seem to be Buddhists who are uncomfortable with what they think is religion, and it's not like we all agree what is religion and what isn't. And I could go on, but I think I'm making my point. There are many, many flavors to Buddhism. Further, it seems natural that certain flavors will appeal to us more than others. Like I said, I have a lot of trouble with durian. I don't know if you know durian, but it smells so strongly that there are signs in hotels that ask, please don't bring durian into your room. So it's not just no smoking, no durian as well. If you've got a certain enzyme, you can digest it and it tastes wonderful. If you lack the enzyme, which I seem to, it smells bad, it doesn't taste good, and it doesn't digest all that well. I wouldn't quite say of certain flavors of Buddhism that they smell bad. But some aspects of some kinds of Buddhism I don't digest very well. Some of the rituals, some of the outer coverings don't appeal to me. And then I find other flavors, certain aspects of Zen Buddhism or Mahamudra in Tibetan Buddhism that appeal to me a lot. That's me personally, and what I'm trying to do is recognize that we're all going to find flavors that appeal to us. That you're here means something about the flavors on offer at Maba appeal to you. I think in the States it's partly a matter of opportunity. Or if you grew up in southern Thailand like my teacher did, there weren't a lot of options. You grew up with the Buddhism around you. This has changed a lot since he was born in 1906. And in just the St. Louis area, many flavors are available, plus the things that people like to mix with Buddhism: Unitarianism, Tai Chi, yoga, psychotherapy, and so on. It might be a good idea for each of us to occasionally check in with how have we gotten involved with the particular flavor that appeals to us. Not make a big deal out of it. In my case, I landed in Thailand with the Peace Corps, and so I got involved in Thai Buddhism. But Thai Buddhism has huge variety, and I gravitated to a particular teacher who I was able to make a strong connection with. I don't fully understand how that happened, but I think it's a good thing to reflect on what's appealing to us, have some sense perhaps why it appeals, and to respect that. Occasionally I meet people who are apologetic about what kind of Buddhism they followed. I think that's sad. One, in this country especially, but it's true more and more in Asia, you can really appreciate the form of Buddhism that you're focusing on, that you're practicing the most, and yet be aware and respect the others. And this gets to something that occasionally or even often creeps up. Sometimes we get so into what we're doing, and here I'm speaking of our particular flavor of Buddhism, although in a way it applies to sports teams, nationalities, and other things. I'll say more about that in a moment. Sometimes we get a bit too much into our preferred flavor. And even by preferring it, we're going beyond that something naturally fits with us. We're comfortable with it. It makes sense. We can start to feel at home. That's all fine. But when it starts to become a preference, and in meditation we see how forming preferences, what it can do in our minds. So to start to see the difference between a natural fit, appeal, it's comfortable enough, probably nothing is totally comfortable, but comfortable enough, and then start to see when it becomes a preference, especially where the preference starts to lead to things like we find ourselves with thoughts or arguments why our flavor is the best. unless you have an attitude like my teachers, they're all the best. This one is the best for me, this one's the best for somebody else. If they're all the best, it's okay to have what's best for you. But often what's best for me starts to become what's best, period. And this easily leads to what's called asami mana. Mana means conceit, and it's the conceit I am. And asami mana is when I am, or in the case of a flavor of Buddhism, we are, then that gets compared to others as better than, worse than, or equal to. This comparing conceit can be very harmful. We'll do it, actually, it's probably a big source of suffering in American culture, where we're one form of comparing is who's got a bigger house, who's got a nicer car, who makes more money. And then in the background of our culture, many of us might be aware of this and somewhat rejecting it, but still it creeps in. So-and-so's better because they make more money, or so-and-so got a degree or a higher degree, or where they got their degree. There are things like this. Or, I don't know if St. Louis, it's probably a lot like Chicago where I grew up, certain neighborhoods, certain suburbs. You know, so-and-so lives in a good suburb. Oh, that's a bad neighborhood. And we start using this language, often it's pretty sloppy, like bad neighborhood. What does that mean? Does that mean the people who live there are evil? Well, actually, we start to treat them. We call a place a bad neighborhood, and then we start to treat people there as if they're bad. And you can read about Ferguson in the newspapers. That's one of the things that can grow out of this habit of asami mana. And we can do it in Buddhism, where it's one thing to appreciate, respect, and love the flavor of practice we're exploring. But if we overdo that to, I'm better than, I hope you're not doing I'm worse than, like, here I am stuck here, I wish I was at a better place. That's really sad. I think the better thans might be more likely to be a problem in this case. But worse than can show up when it's things like incomes, the cars we drive, how we dress, how our kids are doing in school, and other ways of comparing how I am with how we think others are. In terms of Buddhism, this is silly. Here's a couple reasons to illustrate. I'm nominally associated with Theravada Buddhism, and I've met Theravada Buddhists who are convinced we've got the real Buddhism. This is the original Buddhism that the Buddha taught, and that other stuff in China, Japan, Tibet is corrupt. It's later developments, it's corrupt. One historical fact to poke a hole in that hot air balloon is the word Theravada as a school of Buddhism has only been used in this way since 1924. Before 1924, if you went to so-called Theravada Buddhists in Thailand, Sri Lanka, or Burma, and said, "Are you a Theravada Buddhist?" they wouldn't have known what you were talking about. It turns out a monk in Burma who was from Scotland, so he wasn't Asian, but he was living at the time in Burma, was fed up with the Japanese Mahayana propaganda that was in Europe on the ascendance. And so he wanted to push back against the Mahayana propaganda. So he came up with the word Theravada. It's an old word, actually, but originally it meant the recorded teachings. It didn't refer to all the Buddhists in a certain place like Sri Lanka, Thailand, Burma, the way we use it now. And so he was reacting to Mahayanists, in this case, especially Japan, and they were reacting to European scholars who had gone to Asia and found the Pali record of the Buddhist teachings, and these Western scholars decided this is the pure Buddhist teaching. And for a while among European scholars that was put on the pedestal. And that hurt the feelings of some Japanese Buddhists, so they developed a propaganda campaign for the World Parliament of Religions in Chicago in 1993. There's more detail to this story, but I'm not going to try to go into it. But to me it illustrates how these, what often we hear called schools of Buddhism, can develop as much in reaction, and to some extent it can be a form of collective ego or collective asami mana. Now in some cases they're just trying to say, like, I don't know if those I don't remember if the Japanese Buddhists were saying we're better than the Theravadins. Actually, they couldn't. The word Theravada didn't exist. But our Buddhism's better than that stuff. They might have just been saying we're equal to. But that's asami mana as well. That our group is equal to their group, because we're still in kind of collective ego. You know, okay, we're being polite. I'm not going to say my stuff is better than yours. So we do this little dance of equal to. How do we even know? And the problem is it's egoistic. So those are some of the dangers of getting too involved in the surface stuff, the skin, the rind. And if we spend our time just chewing on the skin, and in some cases like oranges, mangoes, bananas, it's not the best part. It's a tragedy then when different flavors of Buddhism, or more broadly religion, get stuck on the outside trappings. It doesn't mean the outside traditions, customs, histories, ways of dress, ways of bowing. It doesn't mean these things are useless. It just means they're not worth getting stuck on. Hopefully we use them skillfully. to avoid asami mana and to be most nurtured by whatever flavor of Buddhism we're drawn to, it seems to me crucial to be mindful of the heart or core of Buddhism. Mindful originally means to remember, to recall. So if we catch ourselves being too concerned by how we bow, how we do this, how we do that, for example, we're worrying. None of these are for provoking anxiety. And you come to a place like this, learn the ropes. That's a way of being respectful. But there's no need to cause yourself anxiousness about it. Be polite, be respectful. But anxiety is not what we practice for. So to keep remembering and coming back to the heart or core. Now, it's not that we understand this right off the bat, but if we keep asking ourselves, what is the deep, profoundly nourishing core of this tradition? If we keep asking ourselves that, if we continue to be mindful of this, then our practice can grow, deepen, and be increasingly meaningful and nurturing to us. I think I have how much?
0. 10 to 15 minutes.
Okay, good. So I'd like to make an attempt to sketch the heart or core of this tradition. In doing so, I'll use a term my teacher used, which is Buddhayana. In his lifetime, and he became a monk in the 1920s, there was the debates about Hinayana and Mahayana, and the Theravadins were saying, we're not Hinayana, we're Theravada, and all that. And one of his comments was, forget about Hinayana, forget about Mahayana, let's all just practice Buddhayana, the vehicle of awakening. And even terms like Mahayana, Venerable Kunshi was telling me some of the different meanings of the term in China. And so you can't assume the Mahayanas in China and the Mahayanas in Tibet mean the same thing. For example, Bodhisattvas, they have fairly different ideas about Bodhisattvas, not to mention in places like Thailand. So anyway, his comment was, let's be most interested in Buddhayana. And part of his approach was to dig into the Pali suttas, the discourses recorded in the Pali language. And as he did so, at the same time, for Thailand, he was quite interested in other versions of Buddhism, Chan, Zen, Tibetan, and read books, the ones available at that time and through the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And his perspective, which I share, is if we go back to the earliest teachings, and now we can also find them in Chinese. There was some historical point where the earliest layer of teachings went down into Sri Lanka and went into China. There's a lot of detail that's not known, but some details of that are known. And there are comparable collections of teachings that seem to be quite early, with fragments in Tibetan and some obscure languages. But the most substantial collections are in the Pali language in China. And now there are scholars and practitioners studying how these are similar. They're very similar. And when they're different, the differences are often illuminating. If we study this body of teaching, we have one approach to finding the heart or core of Buddhism. For example, mindfulness, or to use the Asian word sati, the practice of paying careful attention to life as we live it, and also the ability to bring wholesome things into our minds, hearts, awareness. Sati is not only important in the early body of teaching, it shows up in all the later developments. In so-called Theravada countries, in China, Japan, in Tibet, and it's made its way into Europe, North America, South America, Africa, even Antarctica. There are some Buddhist scientists down there. By making that point, I'm trying to illustrate that the heart that we can trace to the earliest level of teachings shows up with different flavoring, but is still prominent in the later developments, what in the West are called schools of Buddhism, though that's more of a Western term than an Asian term. And mindfulness in the early teaching, it's not just about coping with stress at work, or as the military's using it, being a more effective marksman or something, which Buddhism considers wrong mindfulness. In the Buddhist understanding, throughout both early and in the later developments, mindfulness blossoms into awakening, which is what Buddha represents in all the different flavors. So that's a thread, central, in some ways simple but profound, that runs through all the flavors of Buddhism. Another thread that we find is that the path is seen in three aspects: ethics, how to behave, how to live in relationship to others, material goods, our own bodies, in a way that supports practice. That's one of the problems with the current use of, in some current uses of mindfulness, is they've dropped the ethical part. And from a Buddhist perspective, then it gets easily corrupted without the ethical protection. The strand of ethics goes along with the strand of meditation. cultivating wholesome qualities, kindness, compassion, generosity, a peaceful, calm, strong, steady mind, and so on. And then the third strand is cultivation of insight and wisdom, to understand reality as it's happening. We can study, we can think, but those are to support our ability to see clearly right here and now. So that's another frame. It's very ancient, and again it shows up sometimes with some interesting repackaging, but these three strands of ethics, meditation, and wisdom show up over and over again. I'd like to conclude with a few other core central perspectives that run throughout the flavors of Buddhism. And again, they're found in the earliest level of teachings. Sometimes a later school tries to claim them as their own. Or out of ignorance, one school says, that's not Buddhism, that's that school's, like emptiness. You'll hear Theravadins even today who think emptiness is a Mahayana teaching. And you'll find Mahayanists who have that same ignorance. Historically, not true, because emptiness has been around much longer than Mahayana or Theravada. And it's in the scriptures that those schools claim to treasure. So one key perspective that's always been at the heart of Buddhism is it all depends. Everything depends. Everything is connected, well, not quite connected with, but everything is influenced by, conditioned by, supported by other things. It all depends, which means nothing is truly independent. There's a lot of fighting going on for the sake of independence, and probably a fair amount of confusion that doesn't really understand independence or has the fairly immature understanding that independence means being able to do what I want, which plays out both personally and between nations, where a certain country wants to do what it wants, calls that independence. The Buddhist perspective is nothing is really independent. So if we ponder that, we might lighten up on some of the political violence and nationalism, and also examine our own desires to be independent, especially if that means having it my way and trying to get out of responsibilities. I'm just touching on these things. It all depends. And the insight, which comes from careful practice, noticing how everything happening is depending on other things. And that nothing in our experience, even the me that wants to be independent, is actually independent. And when we see this, the insight, and this comes straight out of the early teachings, nothing is worth clinging to. Sabe dhamma nalang abhinivesaya. Nothing is worth clinging to. My teacher would add, clinging to as me or mine. There's nothing worth being stuck on. There's nothing worth taking too seriously. There's nothing worth fighting for. You know, I'm in America, so I have to be careful. Nothing is worth clinging to as me or mine. And so I'll conclude by noting at the heart of these traditions that collectively we call Buddhism is letting go. Letting go of the I am that's comparing with or in competition with the he is or she is, or the we are and the they are. It's interesting to track in America these days the ways we speak in terms of us and them, whether the us are Americans and the them are the Iranians or the Russians or the Chinese, whoever the bad guys are, which is weird here at Mamba, hosted by our friends of Chinese heritage. Or even another pretty profound wound, the us and them of racism, where us might be white people and them are black people. These are important things to be mindful of, to investigate, and to let go of, because they create suffering and violence within us, between us, and in our world. Thank you for your patience. I offer these reflections on Buddhayana that hopefully will help us all find the peace, freedom, compassion, and wisdom that deep down we all seek.